Welcome to the SuperHero Conversations, a podcast saga with innovation leaders who will be at Supernova, the #1 tech innovation event in Benelux, happening in the end of March 2025 in Antwerp, Belgium. In today's episode, I welcome two superheroes of the Belgian tech ecosystem, Emmanuelle Ghislain, the CEO of Pulse Foundation, and Robin Wauters, the senior advisor at Pulse Foundation. Welcome, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
So for the people who just clicked on this podcast and hear your beautiful voice and see your beautiful face for the first time, how would you introduce yourself? Who are you?
Ladies first.
Ladies first. So, as you said, I'm director of Pulse Foundation since the last 5 years. I studied business engineering, graduated when you were barely born, I guess. And after that, I worked a little bit in the private sector, but quickly got fired, lost my job. At the same time, I had the chance to be dumped by my fiancé too, so I had nothing left to lose. And I left for Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, for 7 years on the field. And I traveled quite a lot, and then I came back here in 2016, launching a social startup. I was the first one of the kind in Belgium. And that was my first entrepreneurial journey with lots of fuck-ups and mistakes. Taught me a lot. And after that, for whatever reason, I got the chance to come and run the foundation. And I wouldn't have taken it at the beginning, but then someone convinced me to, and thanks to that person, I'm here today.
Yeah, so my name's Robin Wauters. I've almost always worked in tech my entire career, but I started out in marketing and media side of things. And I actually became a professional blogger when it was still relatively rare to do so. And then I kind of transformed myself into a technology journalist at TechCrunch and the Next Web. And I ended up starting my own media company called Tech.eu, covering the European tech innovation ecosystems, where I learned a lot about entrepreneurship and policy and investment in this lovely part of the world. And that sort of led me to the next phase of my career, which is more supporting the entrepreneurs and the builders and the operators in this space on a European level through board member seats at the European Startup Network, which is also what Pulse Foundation is a member of, but also in the Belgian tech ecosystem by supporting Pulse Foundation with Beyond, program for scale-ups, and also Syndicate 1, doing pre-seed investments into young companies, young Belgian founders. So a bit of everything.
A bit of everything. Yeah. That's fantastic. So let's go in depth. So what does Pulse Foundation do? What is your role? What are your responsibilities in Pulse Foundation?
So our baseline is demolishing every obstacle towards entrepreneurship. So basically, you can break down the value of a chain of entrepreneurship in different momentum, right? Like from very early stage or very young. How do you stimulate someone? How do you open up the perspective of a young kid that he can actually, do something or create something from scratch. So, for instance, one thing we really work a lot on is like fear of failure, which is fundamental in every entrepreneurial experience. And how do you overcome that fear? And that starts not at 30 years old, but like from the very, very early age. So we are working on every small things that block any entrepreneurs moving forward: access to funding, access to knowledge, access to network, you name it, talents. And we are working around those barriers through three different things, three different methods. The first one is we identify top responses to those problems on the field. So we know that, for instance, if you want to have more entrepreneurs or more people wanting to start a company, you have to have role models. So we will go and look for the best, usually operators, but they are usually non-profits or social profits oriented, who will answer to those questions. That's one thing. The second thing we do is when we see there is not a proper answered problematic on the field, on the market, we create a program based on the problem that we see. So beyond, for instance, the Scale-Up Accelerator was born in 2018 because back at the time in Belgium, you had a lot of things structured around startup, which was great because nothing existed before, but you didn't have anything further down the line. And you need it. So we created that because nothing existed at the time. And then in 2020, we created a program specific for entrepreneurs who had known bankruptcy to help them start again. And it was, of course, during COVID times, many entrepreneurs, and still now today, are just, failing because for many, many external reasons, nothing to do with their own capacity or things like that. And when you think that only 1 out of 5 entrepreneurs who's failed will start again, this is just so much waste. We try to create new entrepreneurs, but the best entrepreneurs are those who actually experience already failure. So we tried that. We work around those programs. And then we have an advocacy pool. So we try to work with the politicians and the decision makers of Belgium and at European level as well to stimulate a more entrepreneurial friendly environment as you would have in Estonia, for instance. It's a great example for us to be inspired from. Like, how do you implement what you did in the country, which is like ours, different with its own specificities. But how do we improve every day? And we do that. We work closely with decision makers, but we also do more broadly advocacy and sensibilization towards public. We imported the Fuck Up Nights, for instance, in Belgium. So yeah, those are the kind of actions we take.
Fantastic. And Robin, you mentioned a lot of things, European Startup Network, Beyond program and so on. So maybe you can go a bit in depth and kind of tell our listeners how does your work actually kind of look like, and how do you drive the innovation in Belgium?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I learned very quickly in my career that I really love entrepreneurship and startups and innovation, but not everybody is fit to start up and scale up a company in the tech space. So I learned very quickly that is not my role. That is not who I'm going to be. But I learned also very quickly that I can play a role in supporting those entrepreneurs. How do you empower them? How do you enable them? How do you connect them to the right talent, investors, other people to start companies with? So almost everything that I do is always in support of entrepreneurs, right? That's always the people that I'm most in awe of, because they're the ones changing the world, building the future, creating the new jobs and the technologies that's going to drive us forward as a human race, as society, humanity as a whole. So I'm always looking for ways to support entrepreneurs. So at Pulse Foundation, that's quite obvious with Beyond, because we support scale-ups in developing their international know-how and connecting them to the right mentors and experts to really get to the next level. For Syndicate One, it's supporting early-stage entrepreneurs in connecting to international investors and scaling up. Through European Startup Network, it's actually getting those examples like Estonia. How do you create blueprints? What works in one country that we can replicate elsewhere? And what does the European Commission, for example, need to know about this, that they can also do this on an EU level? So all of these things are kind of different projects that I get involved with, but it's always with the same reasoning. Like, how do you assist entrepreneurs? How do you take away those obstacles and barriers that Emmanuelle was talking about to enable them, to empower them? Because those are the kind of people you don't want to have anything in their way that doesn't need to be in their way. So that's part of my personal mission.
And I will kind of drill further. So what is the question? How do you do it? How do you enable those entrepreneurs to not be afraid of failure? How do you kind of enable them and empower them?
Yeah, I think part of them is connecting them to a network of like-minded individuals, especially other entrepreneurs, meeting with their peers, showing them that everybody kind of goes through the same kind of problems and they have different ways of solving them. And that already helps a lot. Another aspect is policy. How do you create innovation policies that enable entrepreneurs rather than slow them down or block them from achieving their dreams? Part of it is investment. How do you make sure that access to capital exists in all stages of a company, whether it's pre-seed or Series C and up? You have to enable people to actually get the kind of capital that they need. It could be investment from VC, but it could also be grants, subsidies, could be research grants, etc. And yes, probably a lot more to talk about, but I'll also let Emmanuelle chime in.
Yes. So let's talk about the state of the innovation tech scene in Europe. We're recording this podcast on the March 10th, and I think we're in the midst of a big swirl storm, a big disruption in the European tech, but also politics, but also overall kind of the feeling inside the populace. What are your opinions on the current state of the European tech innovation scene? And later we can kind of zoom in the Belgium. What is going on now? What are the main problems? What are the main success stories or success factors that drive the innovation? And what holds in the future?
So you're right. Like in those moments of uncertainty, there is something certain. It's like getting together and sticking to who we are and to our core values. It's what will bring us on the other side stronger than we were before. So in this crisis, as ever, let's see an opportunity, right? Let's make Europe what it should be and can be. When it comes to innovation, obviously, it's ground material number one, Europe has been forever like leading any kind of innovation in so many fields. It's just plenty and amazing everything, and how far we are on certain topics such as supraconductors, chips, you name it, like biotech, pharma are usually well-renowned as a center of research and development. But like I think the biggest problem, or where lies the biggest opportunity for Europe, is really how do they bring everything they've conceived and searched and discovered in the labs of their universities to actually the markets, and not just in terms of economical values, but everything they have in their drawers could change people's life drastically. So how can we make sure those innovations come to the ground? And it's always been a challenge everywhere. I mean, in the US as well, when it comes to who owns the property of something that's been developed within a university. Some universities do better than others. We have examples in Europe where it works well. We also have examples in Belgium where it works better, but we are far from where we could go and how much we could extract as societal and economical value from those drawers and innovation. So I think for sure it should be, and that you can feel it's becoming topic number one, not just for AI, but for many, many different fields. And I'm very, very pleased that actually a lot of attention is brought to what will make us, unique and prosper as we have been so far.
Mm-hmm. So you would say that the main problem, the main kind of point of development is that the innovation and the research that is done in the walls of universities is not being transcended into the market and is not being capitalized on by the European companies.
I think it's one of the biggest leverage you have in Europe to create more wealth. If you want to put it's like an unexplored field that needs to be unlocked, and that needs. So you have, like a good university in Europe would spin out about like 30 spin-offs a year, which is huge. Like if you look in the numbers in some region of Europe, it's like that number over 10 years. So if you look in the numbers in the US, you triple that, or you make it times 4. So it's the difference. It's huge. Of course, not all of them will be successful. Some will be, will fail, obviously. But so many will bring so much wealth. I don't need to tell you the impact of a unicorn on a country. It's huge. So yeah, I think that's where you can have the biggest focus, and it goes as much on how do you improve the mindset of any students working on research, working on deep groundwork, as much as how do you improve the mindset of the institutions around those researchers, the professors, the universities, the technology transfers office. How do you empower them to be more themselves entrepreneurs in their way of acting?
Mm-hmm. So we identified the main one of the main problems. Robin, what is your kind of take? What could be better elsewhere? So we have this academic problem, but what's on the European tech side? You have seen a lot, and throughout almost 20 plus years. How do you see it evolved, and what is stopping us from becoming even better?
Yeah. So one of the nice things about working as a journalist in this field is that you get sort of a front row seat to what the future looks like, right? And for a long time, that was covering global innovation. Like I was focusing on the US. It didn't really matter to me for a long time where those companies would come from. After a while, you start seeing some pattern. It's pure pattern recognition. You can see the companies that get started in the US were not necessarily better or better equipped or better capitalized even in the beginning than European companies, and that they would often use research or talent from these parts and transfer them over. So that got me sort of thinking, how do we make sure that in Europe we create sort of a foundational layer that helps create the companies of the future, right? So Emmanuelle is very right. Like part of the problem in Europe is unlocking that massive amount of research, talent, and results that we already have. Like we know the numbers, right? We know we can create intellectual property here. We know we have a very deep talent pool of researchers and scientists that are developing amazing breakthrough technology sometimes. The question is, how do you get that to market? That takes a whole system restructuring, a whole different kinds of capitalizing, a whole new way of thinking about it on a European level, but also national. But it also requires a mindset change. And that is the biggest problem that I've ever seen. If the US, people in the US create companies, and if people in Europe create companies, the beginning is almost always the same. The mindset is almost always different from day one, right? They think a lot bigger, they go a lot faster, they don't mind breaking things, and you just go sell things that aren't even there yet to develop them later. Europeans are typically more prudent. They're very careful about how to approach this. They're slower, and they do all the right things, just a little bit slower than their US counterparts. And part of that is mindset. And that is something that I think education can help with. And at a very, very young age, how do we instill this into kids? Like you can start your own company down the line. You can create something. You can help build the future yourself. You don't have to wait for anyone else to do it for you. You can fail and you can get back up and you can do it again. Those type of things, if we don't instill that into our children now, then we're going to lose another generation of people who kind of think inside their box and don't necessarily think the research that I'm doing at this center or at this university or at this school, how do I translate that into market validated, company culture? And that's something that we lack a lot.
Can I give a very concrete examples of a program that exists? And I think it's just amazing the impact they have. So pure Belgian story, but it's turning into international story. So there is this guy who starts this very small project in a small Flemish village, and says, there is so much creativity within the brain of 6 years olds, and there is so much pan, you can keep the creativity alive, right? Like if at some point it decreases because you're like influenced so much. So 6, 8 years old, it's like the sweet spot when it comes to creativity. There is so much there. Then you have like so many, engineers who do engineers, but like they will mostly go work in big companies and, because they don't even consider entrepreneurship because they've never been told, right? So the guy says, well, let's put a group of 6 years old, 8 years old, and imagine the best machine, they dream machine. And they go to the guy from university and they say, you built me my machine. And then the guy from university say, yeah, well, I don't know, have you heard by, I don't know, attraction, the law of attraction. And the kid, what does he say? Like, I don't care. That's basically your problem. But you build my machine. And so the guy, the engineer starts to really like find a solution and it builds a prototype. And then he goes to students in technological and professional directions, which are everywhere in Europe, badly perceived. They are usually like the waste of education. It's although they have gold and they have pearls and gems there, they are badly perceived. So the engineers go to the students there who will actually develop chips and parts of the machine that the engineer can't develop because it's not its expertise, but those guys can. So those guys actually are part of this all engineering thing. And then they have this prototype and then they turn to high school kids and they say, now you go and market it for me. And then you make it, make it a business out of it. And all of a sudden you have this amazing, innovations out of kids' minds going and being alive, you have like crazy things. And this guy started that. And then out of a sudden he wasn't known. Somebody in Switzerland sees this project, say, oh, that's amazing. This guy must come and talk in Switzerland to the UN. And they do it. He has to go to Mexico. And then these guys goes. And then all of a sudden, like you have like 15 countries who've imported his project because it has so much impact on the kids because they understand how creativity can lead to, very, very concrete things. I think it's like double of the kids go to scientific and mathematical direction after because they see the results. Out of all the engineers, you have double engineers who decide to become entrepreneurs because they understand, like, oh, actually I did something and it can be commercialized because those kids in high school, they showed me how to do it. Mm-hmm. So it's a fantastic chain of education. How can you foster every single quality that we have in ourselves to make something good for everyone?
Mm-hmm. So, and what is the kind of the name or who?
It's My Machine. My Machine, and they're fabulous. They really have.
That's really cool. It's
I've never heard of this, by the way. So
yeah, and they're from Kortrijk. Can you imagine?
No way.
Yeah. And they deployed, and before they actually deployed on continental Europe, they deployed everywhere in Africa, in South America, you name it, in Asia. So, amazing. Yeah.
But that's how ecosystems are. I know we have a lot of questions to get through, but this is very important. So if you think of any startup or innovation ecosystem, whatever you want to call it, there's a number of elements, right? You need talent. So you need the business schools, the universities, etc. You need corporates to buy from you, to partner with you, etc. You need policymakers to sort of make the environment that you can thrive in. You need investors to help you capitalize your company so you can grow. You need event organizers like SuperNova to bring people together, to learn from each other, etc. At the heart of any ecosystem, though, is entrepreneurs. You think about like taking the startups and the actual people who are building those companies out of the equation and everything implodes. So the question is, how do you create a funnel to keep entrepreneurs feeding these ecosystems? And I know I talk about it in sort of organic ways, but that's exactly what it is. That's the reason it's called an ecosystem, because it's a living organism, right? So if you don't have enough entrepreneurs and people are willing to take that step, and that's where you have to start at a very young age. Like, make your mindset more, how do I, the creativity, imagination that I have as a young kid, how do I keep that part of myself later in life so I can build a company around that? You can operate a company, you can scale a company. And, to have like a constant funnel of people going into this in Europe, I think is going to be the key to make sure that we have a bright future ahead.
I think that's really interesting if we see that, policymakers talk that there's, not enough entrepreneurs, then entrepreneurs talk that there are bad policies. But in the end, we can see that it really kind of dribbles down to the mindset with which the entrepreneurs are starting. And it's quite radical and it's quite difficult to shift the mindset. But I do believe that it's possible. And when we look at Belgium, I think it's fascinating. Many maybe international people and even Europeans don't actually know that Belgium is a really complex country. It's, I would say, quite fragmented in a sense that basically you have 4 governments and basically like 3 independent countries, stick together. And there's a lot of, I would say, differences, but there are also a lot of similarities. Maybe you can talk about the Wallonian side, so the French-speaking side of Belgium, and Robin, you can talk about the Flanders, the Flemish side, the maybe the more industrialized and the more kind of innovative in a sense that we can see it now. So please, what are the main kind of pluses and minuses? Yes, absolutely.
Can I just say, because I think, to me, I think that's one of the reasons why I'm also so passionate about entrepreneurship and like the entrepreneurs themselves. It's like they don't see through that lens, you see, like we see, like people see it through that lens because that's how we are told by the media and we've been told in schools and stuff like that. But entrepreneurs, they don't give a shit about like who is from where. Mm-hmm. And we can testify that from like the Beyond program where like we gather entrepreneurs from the north and southern part. They have differences, yes, of course, but so much like differences they have between Antwerp and Ghent. Like, I mean, everybody is different. We all have our things. So we don't see through how does that keep us from moving on. It's more like how do we capitalize on that, and I think like the story, and you're absolutely right, a country is fragmented and the stories, it's more about bringing people against each other than together. But I think those stories show us that like the nation we have to be and we can be again, So sorry, I just wanted to have
No, that's really good. So this is my mistake on my side. So we are entrepreneurs. We're kind of open-minded people. So we don't look from the perspectives. But, there's a physical line in Belgium that defines the Flanders and Wallonian. And, the language is different. So maybe you could bring out what are the main kind of strengths of the regions and what are the main weaknesses or what are the points that you should learn from each other?
So you're right to say, much like Europe is fragmented in its own way, Belgium is also fragmented in many ways. And it's true that entrepreneurs don't necessarily care, but they do have constraints that you can't really dream them away. They're always going to be there. I don't think there's really that much of a difference between the Walloon tech ecosystem, Walloon plus Brussels, and the Flemish one. I just think they're a little bit rooted in a different history, where in Wallonia you had traditionally a lot of industry, very tangible industries, and biotech, which is still the case. But then the biggest software company that we have today is coming from that region and not from the Flanders region. So it doesn't necessarily exclude the fact that you can build a software company from there. But I will say that in Flanders, you kind of have the universities that we have in Ghent and Leuven in particular have a very strong history in also supporting innovation, lots of creativity and architects and engineers, etc. So there is definitely a pool of people there that are a little bit more poised to start companies in software, especially B2B, fintech, etc. Than in the southern part of the country, but that's also changing quite rapidly. It only takes 1 or 2 policies on the federal level to really kickstart things to head in the right direction. What I think is also important that we all communicate with each other, that we all connect. We have Supernova and events like Slushed where people can come together. I think there needs to be a bit more connections between physical hubs, connections between entrepreneurial groups and networks, and a lot less fragmentation when it comes to the supporting organizations for entrepreneurs, because that's where you really get into the problems that we have in this country, is that all the budgets and all the support structure is dispersed. Flemish organizations supporting innovation that aren't necessarily talking or coordinating their efforts with the Walloon ones, which I think is kind of mental if you think about it, because Belgium on a world scale is tiny, right? So why not combine these efforts? Why not build more bridges between those organizations to really operate on a pan-Belgian level, if you want to call it that?
So what's the main problem? Why are these three governments not collaborating between each other?
But that's historical reasons. It's just the way it's been since 1830, right?
So, okay, but I we're talking about innovation, but Estonia also was a Soviet Union where they were not allowed to do any business, but they changed the mindset. They changed radically. So, what do you feel should be changed for them to communicate and for them not to be a fragmented fund allocation?
It's going to be very, very difficult to change historical structures in this country. But what I think would help a lot is if you have a federal policy. Imagine that we have, like we have in Europe, a commissioner for startups, research, and innovation. Imagine if we have that kind of person on a federal level that has the power to actually change something in the autonomous regions as well. And that can help connect to organizations like VLAIA, for example, in Flanders, ACT in Wallonia, and bring those organizations together on a federal level to finance them as one instead of separately, and not have like local ministers of innovation, which I don't think makes a lot of sense. That would already help a lot, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Maybe your thoughts on the Flanders, Brussels, Wallonian side of tech.
So I think when you see entrepreneurs coming out and scaling, honestly, you could never say one is from one region because the mindset they have is all the same. They have the same level of ambition. They have the same, challenges. They have the same perspective. They have the same understanding of where they want to go with their companies. So among them, like you don't have, of course, the way, how will they manage their company? Will it change for sure? Yes, probably. Like one will start eating at 1 p.m. The other one will bring the boterham and eat at 12. It's like those kind of things, yes, influence. But altogether, the leader in the end is someone who is driven the same way from one side or the side to the other. The difference is indeed in the ecosystem you have around. So Flanders is probably 10 years ahead from Brussels and Wallonia, I would guess, in terms of funds and development. So now what you can see, what's happening in Ghent, for instance, with the Winter Circus and the funds created around it. And every company now, just growing at a pace that has never been known before in Belgium. Before we would, as Robin mentioned, a Belgian entrepreneur would start and then, would touch the Flemish market and then would maybe try, the Netherlands or Germany. And then, let's move further. Let's go to France and then go open up slowly. And then 10 years later, you're still there with 4 different countries. So now everybody tends to move much faster. You go 1-2 stops in Europe and then you move to the US, right? So we're moving faster on that mine. Is the same thing that happening now. What we see is those companies growing slowly and take 5 years to go from 10 to 30, 40 employees. They tend to be less and less present in the northern part than in the southern part, for instance. Because in the northern part, what you see is they grow from 7 to 70 in 6 months. Because they manage to raise much more funds, they are much more, you have second generation entrepreneurs or, ex-employees from a former unicorn who start their own thing, They have access to broader network. They go beyond the borders of Belgium. So they raise much more funds, much faster. They know the drill, they know how to do it. So that goes faster. In the southern part, you have one unicorn, but it's still not yet having the same impact as it has as some unicorns and some very, very successful entrepreneurs have had in the northern part. If you follow me on that.
And also imagine if Skype stayed let's do Scandinavia first and Estonia and let's maybe move from there instead of thinking global from day one. That would have changed even Estonian tech history, right? Glad that they didn't. Imagine that Spotify said, let's start with Sweden and then expand country per country. It would never have had the impact on the local ecosystem that it's had today. Same goes for Belgium. We have to think beyond borders, let alone language borders, as entrepreneurs, because otherwise we're not going to get there. I will also argue that we talked about ecosystem earlier. You have different elements, but the biggest catalyst for an ecosystem isn't necessarily capital or people. It's exits, right? It's liquidity. If you have one big success story in a region or a city or a country, that tends to accelerate that flywheel that Emmanuelle was talking about. Like it just creates a new generation of entrepreneurs, operators, angel investors, and that gets you to the next level. And then the flywheel just starts spinning faster. And that's what's happening in Ghent now, which I'm sure is going to happen in other places in Belgium as well. You need to keep on feeding that wheel, and that you do with people, talent, and
But capital. I think there is also something very important, and you mentioned it earlier, in the importance of giving back to your country and like to invest in your country, to believe in it. I mean, it's key, and that's something that really try to pass on the messages to those entrepreneurs, is to make them conscious the impact they can have, not only through their companies and making, lots of investors very rich, and everybody will be happy with that, but as leaders, how will they actually drive the future of their region? How can they involve the employees further and faster in the management and through options, through shares, so they can actually, grow. They call now, some of them call themselves gang or mafia or whatever, but create this kind of, ecosystem that brings together. But I think that to make sure that the entrepreneurs of tomorrow perceive themselves as the leaders of tomorrow, and not just of their company, but of society, and the drive that they can actually bring in the society is super important. Like, it's not when a CEO or a founder of a unicorn tweet or LinkedIn, no, we can't say tweet anymore, but like LinkedIn something, and it has a huge impact. It makes a whole difference, not just for the people around him, but like for the generations to come. So those people need to understand their responsibility as role models and as, leaders of society.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned policymaking as being, really important part of that ecosystem. Let's imagine that you're in the federal government of Belgium, and you can change anything, tech ecosystem-wise, overnight. What would you change?
It's a very loaded question, but a good one. So think of it in terms of not just policy making, but policy improving or policy removing even, right? How do you change something in Belgium that benefits most of Belgians? And I think that's where I would say probably enabling talent. And then we go back to education, like how do you enhance the education system and structures that we have to be mindful that we need to create more entrepreneurs down the line or we're not going to make it, right? So that's where I would start. Next one, probably unlocking talent in the universities and the research centers that we already have, making it easier to spin off, have tech transfer offices, be a bit more agile. Now I'm saying multiple things, but it all comes down to talent. How do you make sure that also entrepreneurs can reward talent through ESOP, stock options, for example? How do you make sure that they can attract the right talent, but also retain? That's where we get into more tax discussions, which I'm sure we don't want to get too deep into.
Yeah, we can absolutely. We have time. Absolutely. So you mentioned actually three things. So first, education. Second, the academic and the spin-off thing. And third, the taxation and the stock option plan. Yeah. But let's kind of tap into kind of each and every one of those categories, because I do feel that they are the most important ones to create a sustainable, to create an innovative ecosystem on a policy level wise. So education. So what would you do? Would you implement more entrepreneurship classes inside the schools? Would you begin, in the middle school, elementary school to, for people to bring, again, the My Machine stuff? really cool project. First time I hear about it. What will you change in the education system-wise, Emmanuelle, if you have any thoughts?
Yeah, and then I just need to mention I have a fourth idea.
Absolutely, yes.
If I become a minister or whatever.
Yes. Emmanuelle for ministers.
For president. For
president. So I think the first thing what we studied is if you transform educational system through a project-based learning, it has tremendous impact. So what's a project-based learning? It's basically, it's changing the way you interact with the kids, right? So rather than having a teacher in front of the classroom and explaining, okay, here how you do the math and this is the equation, it's everything through a project. So you decide what project you want to work on is gonna follow you through the year, and every single class will help you developing your project further. So mathematics will help you go further on certain things. Physics will help you further on certain things. Same with the French or English or whatever your language is. So those project-based learning class, if you implement them between 10 and 14, it's the sweetest spot you can have, and tremendous impacts when it comes to switching mindsets. And it's not only the mindset of the students, but because you train the teachers to train like that, you have a systemic impact, because the teachers are stopping being just like replica of, not they just like that, they're fabulous people and I love them. But I mean, they've been trained to be ex cathedra in the way they teach. Now you make them entrepreneurs of their own class and on their own projects. So I think when it comes to education, I believe tremendously in project-based learning, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, and the fourth thing that you wanted to mention?
Yeah, it's, thank you. It's, I think there is a huge responsibility and role that the state is not yet taken when it comes to the participation they have in funds. So, like through the different, way too many funds that we have in Belgium, the BMW and NOSHAC and SFP and extra, all of them take limited partners, right? Limited partners in other funds. I wish those institutions would be much more demanding when it comes to what kind of project do we invest in? How do we make sure that the entrepreneurs that will be funded by this fund are actually responding to different kind of values that we as a country believe in, And it's of course, I'm talking about how do we make sure all entrepreneurs do not look like the same, but how how do they have the right mindset to be those leaders of tomorrow, and those change makers of tomorrow? Do they bring our country further with their companies? So I think my action would be to make mandatory for every limited partnership that a fund would take to ask for conditions in what kind of projects and entrepreneurs are supported, mm-hmm. and not just monetary or economical value conditions. So
you would say that the limited partners that are being invested into venture capital funds and private funds should ask the funds as an overview of who is inside the teams, and what are the main kind of, you mentioned not only the economical factors, but what are the social factors that you need to consider?
Okay, tomorrow you have a fund and there is a guy coming and then he pitches you his project, but obviously the guy is fucking crazy, you can see it from here, he's a psychopath. But still, yes, his model is probably going to run and, he's going to make a lot of money. Do you privilege the fact that he's going to make so much money while he's this kind of person? That he's going to be his impact on the other people he's going to work with, the image he's going to give around. Do you, as a state, that's a question, as a state, do you support this kind of entrepreneurs? Mm-hmm. I don't think a state should.
Yeah, I think I really support that there should be a social factor considered, but maybe one thing that's, most of the founders are a bit crazy. And
there's good crazy and bad crazy.
Yes, there are good crazy and bad crazy.
You should definitely not eliminate the good crazy ones.
But it's always, like it's, and it's more and more the fact, and I'm so happy to hear this, Like when people apply for the Beyond program, so everybody's like, how do you select? What's your criteria? And of course, do we look at the quality and the validity of the business model? Yes, of course. But what will make the big difference? Is it the model or is it the person who brings it? And in the person, what do you see? What are you looking for? Is it someone who's actually conscious? Is he open to listening to advices? When we give you an advice, okay, how does he look at those, And it's more about, like the quality of the leader is not just about how far can you bring your company, but how well can you bring your company to really be sustainable in so many ways? I'm not talking about ESG bullshit kind of thing. I believe in ESG, but it's not just ESG washing. It's truly sustainable. How do you make it sustainable for good,
Fantastic. I think that's a lot of thoughts to kind of comprehend to our policymakers. Yeah. And then, yeah. So we mentioned first education, then we mentioned the social impacts of the founders that the funds are being invested in. Then, Robin, maybe we can go in depth into the taxations and option pools and this kind of field. So what's your take? What should, let's imagine the ministers of the Flemish government that are listening to us now, they definitely should. So what are the policies that definitely should be implemented in Belgium, ASAP?
Yeah, it's a very loaded question again. But I think it's also important to understand that we now have a new government in Belgium. They have an opportunity to transform the way that labor and wealth is taxed, which I think is a really good discussion to have. We now have a huge discussion going on value gains tax, which I think is an important one to have. What I think in Belgium is lacking a lot is to have the voice of entrepreneurs, startups, innovators, builders represented in those discussions. So I feel like if you're a politician in Belgium or a political party in Belgium for that matter, supporting entrepreneurship is not necessarily a priority for you, right? It's not going to win you votes. It's not going to win you popularity contest. So it's very, very difficult for those people to think as an entrepreneur. So what I think is important in that case is that you talk to entrepreneurs, that you enter into dialogue. Okay, if we change our tax system for everyone, how is that going to affect the people who are actually creating the new jobs and creating the technologies of the future and building a future for the rest of humanity? How do we make sure that these people are actually in those discussions? It doesn't necessarily mean cater to them. It doesn't mean create policies only for them that benefit entrepreneurs. It means how do we make sure that we include them in the conversation that we're having so we can take it into account, maybe change, tweak, improve, whatever you want to call it. But all those discussions about tax are almost never about entrepreneurs. They're always about people who own large amounts of real estate or large amounts of shares in public companies or whatever else that their wealth is based on. It's almost never about the ones who are going to create the wealth in the next 5, 10, 20 years. Which I think is a real shame.
Basically, your kind of main advice would be that there are a lot of different ways how you could tax startup, how you could not tax a startup. But the most important, the most crucial point is that those founders of startups of different scales are included in the policy making. Yes. Of the governments.
And I'm saying that because if you go around this Belgian startup ecosystem, you talk to entrepreneurs and investors and other stakeholders, they're not all going to say the same thing about tax. Not everybody agrees about the right way forward. So even within that community, there is no consensus on this is how we need to be taxed, but there is consensus that something needs to change. So if you make them part of the conversation, you can come to a consensus that kind of works for everyone, or that takes into account the needs and desires and concerns of those groups of people. If you don't include them in the conversations altogether, you're never going to have that perspective. And it's almost always going to be bad for those.
Yeah, I do fully agree. And I do believe that it's an extremely valid point. So we all already kind of tripled down on 3 of the...
Can I say one more thing about education? Sorry, I'm going to come back to the topic of education because I think it's important. When you think about your education, you might think about what happened between the walls of your schools. But education is a lot more than that. Education also happens outside of the school. So there is also the possibility, because you don't change the education industry and structure as a whole overnight. It's going to take generations. But you can think about extracurricular activities. What happens outside of the school that can teach people or kids about entrepreneurship and building and creativity and letting their imagination run free? And it could be through media. There's kid-specific media in Belgium that don't necessarily focus a lot on company building and entrepreneurship. You can change that. If you go on a school trip, it doesn't always need to be the planetarium or Technopolis, which is cool, but it could also be actually going to these companies and talking to entrepreneurs and talking to the people who are building these things and showcasing. This is literally role models in front of you, right? So that I think should happen more.
And it's funny you mentioned, but I last year I checked how much is in Belgium every kids go to a ski class, right? Like the kids go with the school to ski. It costs so much money. So many families cannot afford it. Actually, it's extremely uninclusive as a policy. But yet all schools go, and if you can't pay for it, you just don't go, which is extremely. It makes no sense. But so what they did in Austria is that they replaced the ski strip, although ski is part
of their life.
It's holy. Like in Austria, they replaced ski trip through a week of entrepreneurship, and they would only tour companies small, medium enterprise where it had so much impact. It costed €170 per kid, while the other one was can't even remember the name, the figures, sorry. And it was the impact you have on those kids. It was just amazing. They could come and, of course you take a lot of having fresh air and learning a new sport or practicing sport. But how much do you take out of a week when you meet people who are driven by the passion or do something for their life with the passion, and just you go back home and you say, Mom, I don't know what I'm going to do, but I'm going to do something that makes me that happy.
That's fantastic. I big applause to the Austrian
government.
Government, yes. Yeah, that's really nice. And maybe the last of 4 points, we already mentioned the universities, but maybe we can kind of go in depth and see what can we actually do. We mentioned that the innovation process and the innovation speed is much lower. But what can the governments or the universities do about it? What can we do to make the spin-offs 100 times better, bigger?
What can we do for make spin-offs? So first, making spin-offs, I would say that would be a good start. So I think there are different elements. So if you see the results they obtain, and they've implemented that in UK, and they're starting it in Belgium, in Flanders mostly, is how do you make sure that you have the winning team from the start? So the winning team being not just the CTO or the researcher, but that you pull together an expert, a seasoned entrepreneur, ideally, who will actually bring the business together. So you pair. First thing is, how do you make sure this pair happen? If it doesn't happen on the bench of the classes, how do you accompany the entrepreneurs so are the right match for him? And how do you push that further? Second is how do you gather, obviously, the first funds, etc. So it's I tend to be cautious when it comes to that, specifically on the spin-off, because it's been shown that PhD students are much more aware and at ease when it comes to applying for funds from the European Commission than an entrepreneur is. So actually, it's there is a positive effect of being a PhD student who's been supported, because you know a little bit the trick around the European, although it's different paths, you know how to apprehend it. So I think for them, it's more about how can we have the right business mindsets, because that's probably the most thing they lack from the beginning, and pull it out. And then, I believe around those, the question of funds, it's going to be aligned. And what we see now is that Europe has put so much focus on that. I can't believe it's not going to be aligned in the next 3-5 years.
Fantastic. So basically connecting those, technical people with the business people and vice versa to kind of foster the first team that will kind of do the quick implementation to market.
Another aspect of this is that we usually compare to the US, right? But what happens at Stanford University in terms of spin-out and tech transfers and the way that they're incentivizing even professors and members of the faculty to actually get into entrepreneurship or angel investing, you can't replicate that. That I've learned, you cannot just take that model, bring it to Europe, and it's going to work. So you always have to take into account local constraints. One of them, which is capital, right? University endowments in Europe spend more money investing in funds in the US than they do in Europe. So start there maybe, right? So, and then the rest is incentivizing people to actually start, even during their education, maybe, get some time to actually implement that idea and try to turn it into a market validated business. It could be a good start. So you need to incentivize people to actually do that, pay them for it, or give them time off. And then the members of the faculty, actually people working in that research who have authority on this, how do you get them involved? And then you need a whole system around IP, because how do you protect it? How do you monetize it? How do you value it? And the next one is capital. How do you actually fund it? Where does the money need to come from? So it's all big questions to ask. I would love to see sort of a map of what it's like in Europe, where are the best practices, what works in Estonia might work in Spain, might not, but at the very least talk to each other, map sort of what works, what doesn't, and try new things.
Yeah, but I think that the problem of funds can be easily solved with the endowment problem. If you think about
is
it,
always relative. But I'll give you an example. Pension funds in Europe right now spend 0.07% on venture capital as an asset class. So that's a number that's well known and it's documented. In Italy, there is now a program that says, okay, from now on, pension funds need to invest 0.1% in Italian funds. You know what happens? Italian funds are spooked. They say this is way too much because it's going to flood the market with so much capital that it's going to distort everything. And they're right. You don't go from 0.07% to 0.1. It's a huge step to take. Even if you go only to 0.1 in all of Europe, but you structure it and you actually implement limitations on it, that you don't distort the markets from day one. You go into phases. That could work, and it has to work. And it's a conversation that's being held already on a European level. It's called Capital Market Union, if you really want to go deep into it. But I'm glad things are finally shifting, because that's of course where the money is, and it's going to come from.
Definitely, and I think it's a bright future that is ahead of us. But we live in interesting times where we see the DEI policies in the US shifting so rapidly. Within a month, most of the 5 biggest tech firms in the world kind of shifted their DEI policies overnight, basically. There has been a lot of fuss, a lot of things said about DEI. What is the best way to do DEI? Maybe you could kind of share your perspective on what is actual inclusivity inside a company, and how to make your startup, your company, and diverse, inclusive, and the most important thing, innovative place.
So we talk a lot about those who have adopted the non-DEI policy overnight. But we also know some who've refused to implement it. And those who have refused it did not do it just for the fun of refusing it. They've refused it because they know how precious it is for the profit generation and for the capacity of innovation. So it's not just for the fun or for, the gallery that they've refused, but because it's grounded in the capacity of innovation. So if you are, what is showing us now is basically, and it's not so bad in the end. What is making light on is who has really believed and done diversity and inclusion in its company and made it like a core value out of it, and who hasn't, and just like been diversity washing over the last years. So it just makes things clear of who is where. And then for those who have started it, like, I mean, there are so many cases around of companies that, you know, like how many studies have been done about the impact of DEI. If you do a proper inclusion in your company and not just diversity, how does it impact your capacity of problem solving? Mm-hmm. By 87%, you're sure your company will solve faster and better a problem. You know it. You know, like numbers are between 20 and 35 when it comes to profit increase if you have a more diverse company. But every company is more innovative if you have more diverse people, point, period. So it's more about like, if you do it, make sure, you know, and the fun fact is I'm just thinking about it, like, there are so many entrepreneurs who actually already do it and they don't know it. Because in diversity, everybody thinks always, okay, minorities, women and minorities, right? But it's way more than that. It's like people with handicap. And then when you talk about handicap, you're like, yeah, with the wheelchair or the blind guy. But what about autism? And how many autistic person do you actually have in your company? When you have developers, they have a lot of them who are on the spectrum of neurotypia or quite on something. What do they do? And it's very interesting. I talked with a unicorn here in Belgium, and they were like, when we had to move back people in the office after COVID because we couldn't manage. But we all know, like, we put all the tech and the developers, we put them there because they have with their headphones on their ears anyway all the time, and we don't talk to them. And they had like 200 people not talking to each other in the you're like, and then why do you bring them back home? Like, if it's not to do anything with them, it's a policy, we have to do it. Mm-hmm. But then if they are there, why don't you try to include them? But they don't want to. I was like, but maybe they don't want to be included the way you see it, because you see it through your eyes. Have you asked them, how do they want to be included? And actually, they've never asked. So they're like, they actually are super diverse, but they're not aware they are, because it's not visible as when you're Black or when you're a woman. But you do diversity. But if you don't take in consideration that you can't include, you can start including if you don't know you are diverse. So first start by recognizing the diversity you have in-house, and then think, okay, how can I take profit out of it, not just for their well-being, but because I will get a lot of that.
So you've talked a lot about the kind of the washing, the not real part of the DI movement. So what is the key factors to making an actual inclusive company? You mentioned talk to the people who you want to include them in the conversation. But what else? What are the composites of this DEI movement?
I think it's interesting to see some companies they've been created based on this core value. If you have that from the start, and then there is a very famous unicorn that is around insurance, and the founder of it will tell you, honestly, I didn't want to do insurance, but I did know how I wanted to do a company and how I would organize a company and what would be the governance out of it. And I created what would be my ideal company. And then, insurance was the best product to fit the idea. Mm. So he used the product to fit the idea he had of a company. So I think, I'm not saying you should go on that part of the spectrum, but I'm just saying, if you ground it from the start that this is gonna be necessary, because you need to be innovative, you need to be resilient, and you need to be problem solving all the time. How do you import that from the scratch to make sure you have it sealed from the beginning? So first, I would say, don't think it's like just a nice thing to add at some point on your trajectory. I think if it's not there from the beginning in your mind, then it's already too late. Make sure you have it. And if you didn't have it, then you need to take your guts and actually go out there and review everything, because you'll have to review everything. So first thing, make sure you're there. Then after, it's more like, okay, how can you indeed talk to people, include them in the decision? How do you draft your governance model? And by governance, not just how do you make your board more inclusive, or, it's how do you draft this decisions process in the company? And you build up like that. It's more, honestly, I'm not an expert on the question, and there are many of them who are, but what I see from the entrepreneurs is those who've started with that. Airbnb is a great example. They've had it from the beginning, from the start. They had a strong DEI policy. Well, I don't need to tell you where they are.
Guys, I think this is a really fascinating conversation, and maybe we can finish this up with a kind of the two quick questions. Since our podcast is about superheroes and superpowers, what are your superpowers? What are you really, really good at that you think empowers you to kind of move further?
Ladies first. Okay. Making myself easy.
I think people told me is I'm extremely engaged. I'm true believer in what I say. I always remain very authentic to my beliefs, and I think I'm a good visionary, not in the sense of predicting the future or anything like that, but it's more I kind of understand. I kind of manage to analyze very quickly the different elements and understand where this leads us. And the combination of both makes it very strong for me, and it gives me this energy to wake up every morning. It's this combination. It's not one or the other. It's both.
That's really good. Robin, you?
Mine is curiosity. There was once a conference called Digital Freedom Festival in Latvia. I had like promotional posters, and one of them said, "Curiosity is what got us to the moon." And I actually asked the organizers to print that out for me, and I have it in one of my kids' bedrooms on the wall, because I think it's so important. And I think my biggest strength or superpower is being curious about everything always, right? So that's whatever leads me to the next step in my career or life is always going to be curiosity. I want to learn things. I want to learn from people. I want to learn from other ecosystems, other cultures. So that's something that continues to drive me. So I think it's also something that I would love to share with anyone, including my children, of course. But that's, if I would have the power to give curiosity to everyone, that's what I would do. I think the world would be a much better place.
Yeah, this is a really nice one. My last question, maybe the most important one and the most difficult one, is what is your dream?
Now you start.
Oh, God damn it. So my dream would be that we start talking to each other again. And I mean that as society as a whole. I think we've gotten to a place somehow where people no longer talk, they say things and they share their opinions, but they're not interested in listening to someone else's opinion and actually learning from each other and having a conversation that leads to new insights. I think more and more we're shifting to groups and camps and rivals and, rivaling opinions that lead to geopolitical tension and whatnot. I don't want to get too deep into it, but my dream would be for us to start having conversations with one another again. So if we can somehow expedite that, stimulate it, create places, could be virtual, could be offline, where people can come together again and sit down,
create conferences.
Conferences is a good example. But that's also the reason we still have conferences in the first place, because we used to have virtual conferences only during COVID, and we went back to physical. Why? Because we were very, very much in need of human connection and feeling that sort of connection with other human beings at a physical place. It's just never going to go away. It's so ingrained within our DNA, but it doesn't necessarily mean that conversations are still happening in a healthy way, which I think we need to get back to at some point. That's my dream.
I think mine is making sure that everyone can be the best version of him or herself at any time, anywhere. It's fitting your own place, not fitting a box or, just being where you have to be with what makes you special.
That's fantastic. I think with that positive note, we'll wrap up this conversation. So thank you guys for this wonderful conversation. Again, as you mentioned, conferences, an extremely important part of the tech innovation scene, where you connect, where you talk, where you don't only tell or share your opinion, but also listen. So if you want to, share your opinions to the people and listen from the people like Robin and Emmanuelle, please do come to SuperNova. That is happening in the end of March 2025 in Antwerp, Belgium. And see you guys there.
See you there.
Thank you.
Thank you.